The air was thick with smoke, a bitter reminder of the battle that had just torn through the village. Explosions had ceased for a brief moment, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the groans and cries of the wounded. Among the chaos, one woman moved with a calm determination that seemed almost impossible: Barbara Young. While most had fled, retreating to safer ground, she stayed behind, alone. She could have run, could have found safety, but instead she knelt beside shattered bodies, hands trembling only slightly as she tried to stem the flow of blood, whispering words of comfort to soldiers who had no idea if they would see another sunrise. The stench of gunpowder clung to her clothes, mingling with the coppery scent of blood, and every heartbeat seemed amplified in the silence that surrounded the destruction. Yet Barbara moved from soldier to soldier, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She had a purpose, she had a duty, and even in the face of unimaginable horror, she refused to abandon them. Some men looked at her with confusion, others with gratitude, but all were silently reassured by her presence. They weren't alone anymore. Hours stretched like eternity. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that mirrored the carnage on the ground. Barbara didn't notice. Time had lost meaning. She had one mission: ensure that those who could be saved survived the night. She tore strips from her own clothing to bind wounds, used makeshift splints, and whispered promises of hope. She held hands, soothed cries, and stayed present in a world that had turned upside down. Every groan, every whimper, every tear fueled her resolve. Nearby, abandoned weapons and broken helmets littered the ground, the remnants of men who had fought bravely but had been felled by the relentless tide of war. Barbara's eyes scanned for anyone who still needed her help. She was meticulous, almost mechanical, but there was a tenderness beneath the efficiency. Every life mattered, and she made sure each person she touched felt seen, heard, and cared for. She became the anchor in a sea of despair, a lifeline for those whose world had collapsed around them. Darkness crept across the battlefield. Shadows danced over the twisted remnants of the fight, and the first cold whisper of night air settled over the land. Barbara refused to stop. Her hands ached, her body screamed for rest, but she pushed through every ounce of exhaustion. One soldier's labored breathing, another's frightened gaze, these were the things that kept her moving. She hummed softly, a tune from home, trying to remind them all that life still existed beyond the horror, that the world they knew wasn't entirely gone. The screams had mostly subsided, replaced by the quiet groans of the injured. Barbara had created a fragile island of calm amidst the devastation. Her eyes, rimmed with tears she refused to shed, caught the reflection of the moonlight on the bloodied earth. She barely noticed. Her focus was unwavering. Every decision she made was the difference between life and death, and though she did not speak of fear, it lived in every nerve of her body. Yet, courage isn't the absence of fear. It is acting despite it, and she acted, relentlessly. Somewhere in the distance, faint cries for help reached her ears, and she sprinted, almost blindly, toward the sound. Her shadow stretched long and thin over the battlefield as she moved, a solitary figure in a world gone mad. Soldiers who were once shouted, cursing, or crying now watched her with something resembling awe. She became more than a nurse, more than a woman. She became a force. Her presence reminded them of what they were fighting for, even if the war itself seemed endless. By the time the first tendrils of dawn began to pierce the smoke-choked sky, Barbara had done what seemed impossible. She had kept dozens alive, sometimes by the thinnest thread. Exhaustion had taken its toll, and her body trembled, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had fulfilled her promise to stay, to comfort, and to fight in her own way. The battlefield was silent now, not in peace, but in temporary reprieve, and Barbara, alone, had been its unwavering guardian. Her story would not be shouted across headlines, nor would it earn medals or fanfare immediately. But in the hearts of those she saved, and in the memory of those who witnessed her courage, she became a legend. Barbara Young, the woman who refused to abandon the wounded, who stayed when everyone else fled, a solitary light in the darkness of war. The night had barely receded when the sounds of distant artillery reminded Barbara that the battle was far from over. The wounded she had tended were barely stable, yet the war pressed forward relentlessly. Each echo of gunfire, each faint whimper, carried her back into the chaos she had chosen not to flee. Others would have considered it madness, but for Barbara, there was no other choice. She could not leave them. Every soldier she helped carried a piece of her courage with them, and that was worth any personal risk. She moved carefully among the debris, scanning the ground for signs of life. In the pale morning light, the twisted forms of men, once full of energy and determination, now lay sprawled in positions that spoke of horror beyond comprehension. Barbara knelt beside one young private, whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. His eyes were wide, filled with a combination of fear and disbelief. He hadn't expected anyone to stay behind. Barbara's hands moved quickly but gently as she applied a tourniquet. She murmured reassurances, words that seemed almost fragile against the harshness of the battlefield, but somehow they reached him. He squeezed her hand, and for a fleeting moment, the war seemed a little less merciless. Time blended into itself. Hours became moments, and moments stretched endlessly. Barbara had no sense of hunger or thirst. Her mind and body were consumed entirely by the task at hand. She crafted makeshift stretchers from broken wood and torn blankets, carrying the injured to safer spots as the first faint beams of sunlight revealed the full scale of destruction. Each step was deliberate, every movement weighed with responsibility. This was more than a battlefield. It was a testament to human suffering, and she had made it her mission to preserve as much life as possible. A sudden scream shattered the tentative calm. Barbara froze, instinct sharpening her senses. From the rubble, a soldier emerged, bloodied and panicked, clutching his side. Without hesitation, she rushed to him, ignoring the splintered wood and glass that littered the path. She assessed his injuries with a precision born of desperation and experience. He was badly wounded, but not beyond hope. Her hands, coated in dirt and blood, worked quickly, binding, bandaging, and offering words that reminded him of a life beyond this battlefield. She refused to acknowledge the fear that threatened to swallow her. Fear had no place here. Only action mattered. Around her, the battlefield began to fill with the weary, the injured, and those who had narrowly escaped death. Barbara became a constant presence, moving like a ghost between the living and the dying. Each life she touched was a small victory against the vast tide of war that threatened to overwhelm everything. Men whispered her name in gratitude, even as they shivered from cold and pain. To them, she was more than a nurse or a medic. She was a symbol of unwavering resolve in a world that had lost all certainty. The day stretched on, and Barbara's body began to protest with fatigue so deep it seemed almost impossible to bear. Yet she pressed on, driven by something beyond duty or courage. She was guided by an unspoken understanding that every second mattered. A soldier who could be moved, a wound that could be treated, a hand that could be held. These were her victories. And she accumulated them quietly, leaving no recognition, no expectation of reward. Her only goal was survival and comfort for those who had been abandoned by fate. She noticed a small group huddled in a corner, shaking from cold and shock. Their eyes reflected a mixture of terror and hope as she approached. With gentle words and careful movements, she helped them, offering blankets, water, and encouragement. She understood that survival was as much mental as it was physical. By staying calm, she gave them something to cling to, a sense that life could still exist amidst the ruins. As dusk approached, the battlefield fell into a tense, fragile silence. Barbara allowed herself a fleeting moment to sit, leaning against a shattered wall. Her hands ached, her body screamed for rest, but she forced herself to breathe, to stay present. Every sound in the distance reminded her of the war's relentless pace. Yet she felt a quiet pride in what she had accomplished. Dozens of lives had been spared because she refused to abandon them. And in the quiet of the approaching night, that mattered more than anything. Barbara Young was no stranger to fear, but she had learned to convert it into determination. The wounded she had comforted would never forget her, and even in the darkest hours of war, her courage would echo in the hearts of those she had saved. She had stayed when others fled, faced danger when most would have hidden, and her unwavering spirit became a beacon, a fragile but powerful testament to the human capacity for bravery and compassion. The first stars began to appear in the sky, faint pinpricks of light above the battlefield, but Barbara hardly noticed. Her attention was entirely on the wounded who still clung to life around her. Each groan, each shallow breath demanded her presence. She moved through the rubble like someone possessed, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, whispering words of reassurance that sounded almost like prayers in the cold night air. The world outside this small pocket of survival could collapse entirely. Barbara's focus would not waver. A young corporal, barely more than a boy, shook violently as he tried to comprehend the horrors that had unfolded. Blood stained his uniform, a grim reminder of how close death had come. Barbara knelt beside him, her hands gentle but precise as she tended to his wounds. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice firm, unshakable. The boy's eyes flickered between fear and disbelief, searching hers for proof. Barbara gave him the anchor he needed, unwavering attention, calm strength, and the certainty that someone was still willing to fight for him, even when the world had turned against them. Around her, the battlefield was quiet but tense, a fragile calm that could shatter with a single stray shell. Barbara's movements were deliberate, every action measured. She shifted stretchers, repositioned the injured for comfort, and murmured encouragement. She understood that sometimes survival was not just about stopping bleeding or setting bones. It was about keeping hope alive. In her presence, the wounded felt that hope, faint but unmistakable, like a small flame flickering against the night. Hours passed. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, but Barbara refused to yield. She moved with an almost otherworldly grace, carrying water, distributing rations she had scavenged from abandoned packs, and holding trembling hands until shivers subsided. Some soldiers whispered her name, barely audible over the wind and distant echoes of battle. To them, she had become more than a helper. She was a symbol, proof that courage and compassion could coexist even in the most merciless circumstances. A sudden movement caught her eye. A soldier, separated from the rest, tried to crawl toward a safer area. His face was pale, lips blue with cold. Barbara didn't hesitate. She rushed across the uneven ground, ignoring the jagged debris and remnants of war around her. She reached him, gripping his arm and dragging him to the small circle of safety she had maintained. Her hands moved quickly, binding wounds, adjusting clothing, speaking in soft tones to steady his trembling mind. Fear might have gripped anyone else, but Barbara's resolve never faltered. By midnight, the battlefield had transformed into a landscape of muted cries and restless shadows. Barbara paused only briefly, wiping sweat and grime from her face. Her body screamed for rest, but she had no time for such luxuries. Each life mattered too much. Each small victory against death was precious. She moved among her charges with relentless energy, listening for every whisper, every cough, every sign of distress. She had become attuned to the subtle rhythms of suffering, predicting needs before they were voiced, acting with instinct honed in the crucible of disaster. Some soldiers had begun to whisper stories of her bravery to each other, a quiet legend forming among the survivors. "She never leaves us," one murmured. "She stayed, just stayed, when everyone else ran." Barbara did not hear them, and she did not need to. Recognition was irrelevant. She worked in silence, driven not by glory, but by the raw human need to care, to prevent life from slipping away when all else had failed. The night deepened, but Barbara's vigilance never wavered. Each small movement, each careful adjustment of a blanket or bandage, each whispered word of comfort was a rebellion against the overwhelming chaos around her. In her eyes, the wounded were not just victims. They were evidence that hope could exist, that humanity could survive, even in the darkest hours. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon, Barbara allowed herself a single, brief glance at the devastation around her. The battlefield was littered with reminders of the merciless reality of war. Yet, within her small circle of care, dozens of lives had been preserved. She had fought a quiet battle alongside the soldiers, not with guns or artillery, but with steadfast courage, tenderness, and relentless determination. Barbara Young's presence that night would become legend among the soldiers she saved. Though the wider world would never know the full extent of her bravery, in the hearts of those who survived, she was immortal. A woman who refused to abandon the wounded, who faced the horrors of war alone, and whose courage illuminated the darkness like a single, unwavering torch. Morning light crept slowly over the battlefield, casting long, cold shadows across the shattered earth. Barbara Young's eyes barely registered the rising sun. She was already moving, her focus never leaving the wounded around her. The soldiers she had tended through the night were fragile, but alive, each one a testament to her relentless courage. Every movement she made was careful, precise, driven by the unshakable knowledge that even one mistake could mean a life lost. She approached a young private whose breathing was shallow, his uniform soaked with blood. Panic flared in his eyes as he realized how close he had come to death. Barbara knelt beside him, hands steady, voice calm, whispering words that carried both authority and warmth. "You're safe now," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, she became more than a healer. She was a lifeline, an unyielding presence in a world where death had become routine. The battlefield, once filled with the noise of gunfire and explosions, was now eerily quiet, a deceptive calm that could break at any moment. Barbara moved through the debris with almost unnatural awareness, scanning for soldiers who had been overlooked, for signs of life in the shadows. Each discovery brought a surge of urgency. Each saved life, a small victory that pushed her forward despite exhaustion. Her hands were raw, her body screaming, yet she did not stop. There was no room for hesitation, no allowance for fatigue. A group of men huddled together, shivering from cold and shock, looked up as Barbara approached. Their eyes reflected relief, confusion, and awe all at once. She knelt, offering blankets, water, and gentle reassurance, whispering words of courage into ears that had forgotten what hope felt like. She moved seamlessly from one soldier to the next, a blur of determination in a landscape scarred by violence. To them, she was an anchor, steady and unwavering, amidst a storm that had shattered everything familiar. Suddenly, a cry pierced the air, a soldier trapped beneath rubble, writhing in pain. Barbara's heart raced, but she did not falter. She sprinted toward him, navigating jagged remnants of war, ignoring the danger that surrounded her. Reaching him, she assessed his injuries with a trained eye, improvising solutions with what little material she had. Her fingers worked quickly, tying, wrapping, stabilizing, whispering reassurance that seemed almost impossible in the chaos. Fear might have paralyzed anyone else, but for Barbara, action was the only response. The hours stretched on, each one filled with the relentless demands of care and survival. Barbara moved with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, tending to the injured, comforting the frightened, and offering a semblance of humanity in a world that had become unrecognizable. She shifted makeshift stretchers, offered water, hummed softly to those too weak to speak, and remained vigilant against any sign of danger. Her presence alone seemed to lift the weight of despair from the soldiers she touched, reminding them that someone still believed in life amidst destruction. By late afternoon, the battlefield had transformed. The worst of the fighting had passed, leaving behind a haunting stillness, broken only by the groans and coughs of the injured. Barbara took a moment to glance over her work, the small circle of life she had carved out amid the devastation. Dozens of soldiers owed their survival to her hands, her courage, and her unwavering resolve. She felt the exhaustion settling deep into her bones, yet there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had made a difference, that she had been a force of hope in the darkest hours. Nearby, some soldiers whispered among themselves, recounting her actions, forming a quiet legend that would endure long after the battle had ended. Barbara paid them no mind, yet the knowledge that she had inspired courage, comforted fear, and saved lives lent her a silent strength. She had become more than a woman in a war zone. She had become a symbol, proof that even amidst chaos, compassion and bravery could shine through. As evening approached, she continued her work, moving tirelessly from soldier to soldier, bandaging wounds, adjusting blankets, and offering encouragement. The battlefield, scarred and unforgiving, became her domain, a place where one woman's determination stood as a bulwark against despair. Barbara Young had chosen to stay when others fled, to comfort when others despaired, and to fight in a way that no weapon could match. By nightfall, she finally allowed herself a brief pause, leaning against a crumbled wall. Her hands were battered, her body aching, yet her spirit remained unbroken. The soldiers she had saved were breathing, alive, and for Barbara, that was enough. She had faced death, despair, and chaos alone, and she had emerged as a force that no battle could diminish. Barbara Young's courage would live in the hearts of those who survived, a testament to the power of human will and the quiet heroism of one woman who refused to abandon the wounded. Night had fallen again, but the battlefield remained alive with the faint sounds of suffering and survival. Barbara Young moved quietly among the wounded, her eyes scanning for anyone who had been missed, anyone whose life could still be saved. Each groan, each shallow breath pulled her forward with relentless determination. The darkness was no comfort, only a veil over the devastation, but she carried her own light, small and steady, through the chaos. A young soldier, barely able to sit upright, looked up as Barbara approached. Blood had dried along his temple, and fear clung to his expression like a shadow. She knelt beside him, her hands moving swiftly and confidently as she cleaned the wound and applied a makeshift dressing. "I'm right here," she whispered. "You're not alone." The boy's trembling hands clutched hers, drawing strength from her calm presence. In that instant, Barbara became more than a nurse. She was a lifeline, a tether to hope in a world that had nearly abandoned them. The battlefield stretched endlessly around her, littered with debris, shattered helmets, and the remnants of what had once been men full of life and dreams. Yet within her small circle, life endured. Barbara shifted stretchers, offered blankets, and distributed water she had scavenged from abandoned supplies. Each movement, each small act, was a refusal to surrender to the overwhelming despair. Her hands were raw, her body screaming for rest, but she ignored the ache, the hunger, the exhaustion. Every second she could give was a second closer to survival for those who depended on her. Suddenly, a faint cry reached her from a distant corner. A soldier trapped beneath fallen timber had been struggling silently. Barbara ran, navigating the jagged ground with precision, ignoring the pain in her own body. Reaching him, she assessed the injuries with practiced efficiency, improvising a solution from torn clothing and splintered wood. Her hands moved with steady purpose, binding wounds, lifting debris, whispering reassurance, as if the act of speaking could breathe life back into him. Fear had no dominion here. Courage filled the space instead. Hours passed with little reprieve. Barbara's movements became a blur, almost mechanical in their precision, yet each action was infused with compassion. She checked pulses, shifted bandages, and murmured soft encouragement to the soldiers too weak to respond. Her presence alone was a stabilizing force. Even in the chaos of war, she offered a semblance of humanity and order. Men who had seen death and destruction stared at her in awe, some silently whispering thanks, others too weak to speak. She needed no recognition. Her satisfaction was found in the lives she preserved. The night deepened, colder and darker than before, yet Barbara pressed on. A group of soldiers huddled together, shaking from fear and cold, caught her attention. Their eyes were wide with disbelief when she approached, but she knelt among them, offering blankets, water, and soft words that carried the weight of unwavering resolve. She hummed a quiet tune, something from home, a fragment of normal life, and for a moment the soldiers forgot the horrors surrounding them. In her presence, hope was tangible. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, a faint promise of light in a land scarred by violence. Barbara continued her work, moving from soldier to soldier. Each life she touched a small victory against despair. Exhaustion clawed at her limbs, but she refused to surrender. She had witnessed what the battlefield could take, and she knew that every second mattered. Survival depended on vigilance, on compassion, and on the courage to remain present when all else had fled. Some soldiers had begun to speak quietly among themselves. "She never leaves anyone behind," one whispered. Another nodded, eyes wide with respect. Barbara heard none of it, but even if she had, it wouldn't have mattered. Her reward was not praise or recognition. It was the heartbeat of a soldier she had kept alive, the faint rise and fall of breath in the darkness. Every life saved was proof that courage could endure, even when everything else had crumbled. As night faded completely into morning, Barbara allowed herself a brief pause, leaning against a broken wall. Her hands were raw, her body aching, but her spirit remained unbroken. Around her, the wounded rested, temporarily safe. And for the first time since the battle began, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of accomplishment. She had stayed. She had fought, not with weapons, but with unyielding determination, tenderness, and courage. Barbara Young's presence that night would live on in the memories of those she saved. Though medals and headlines might never acknowledge her deeds, her bravery and compassion had become legend among the soldiers. She had refused to abandon the wounded, face danger alone, and, in doing so, had illuminated the darkness of war with a light that no bullet, no shell, no despair could extinguish. The morning air was cold and sharp, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth scorched by artillery fire. Barbara Young moved among the wounded, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every sign of life. She had become instinctively aware of the smallest movements, the faintest sounds, the subtle cues that could mean the difference between life and death. Each breath she took was synchronized with urgency. Each heartbeat pushed her forward. She found a soldier slumped against the remnants of a collapsed wall, barely conscious, his uniform torn and bloodied. Panic flickered in his eyes as he realized how close he had come to death. Barbara knelt beside him, her hands steady, precise, unwavering. She cleaned the wound, applied a makeshift bandage, and whispered words meant to calm both body and mind. "You're safe," she said. "I'm right here. You're not alone." In that moment, her presence alone became a shield against fear, a lifeline tethering him to hope. The battlefield stretched endlessly, littered with broken wood, shattered helmets, and the remnants of a struggle that had consumed everything in its path. Yet, amid the chaos, Barbara carved a small circle of survival. She moved seamlessly from one soldier to the next, distributing water, adjusting blankets, and whispering encouragement. Her hands were raw, her body exhausted, but she did not falter. Every small act, every careful movement was an assertion against despair, a testament to the human will to protect, to care, to survive. A faint cry drew her attention, a soldier trapped beneath debris struggling silently. Without hesitation, she navigated jagged terrain, ignoring the danger and pain, reaching him swiftly. Her hands worked efficiently, improvising a solution from torn clothing and splintered wood. She whispered encouragement, steadying him with words and presence. Fear had no place here. Only action, compassion, and determination mattered. Hours blended into one another. Barbara's movements became fluid, almost mechanical, yet each was charged with life-saving purpose. She checked pulses, shifted bandages, and murmured words of hope to those too weak to respond. Soldiers stared at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. To them, she had become a constant, a symbol of resilience amidst chaos. Recognition was unnecessary. The reward was in the breaths that returned to shallow lungs, in the faint pulse of life she preserved. The night grew colder, darkness creeping into every corner. Barbara noticed a small group huddled together, shivering and terrified. She knelt among them, offering blankets, water, and calm words. Her soft hums carried through the air, a fragile reminder of life beyond the battlefield. The soldiers held on to her, their fear tempered by the unyielding courage that radiated from her. In that moment, hope became tangible, almost palpable. As dawn approached, she continued tirelessly, moving among the wounded with precision and grace. Her body ached, her hands bled from hours of relentless care, yet she pressed on. Each life mattered too much to stop. Each second lost could be fatal. Barbara had become the pulse of this small sanctuary, a fragile island of survival in a sea of destruction. Soldiers whispered her deeds quietly among themselves, recounting her courage in hushed tones. "She never leaves anyone behind," one murmured. "She stays, always stays." Barbara didn't hear them, nor did she need to. Recognition was irrelevant. The impact of her actions was evident in the lives she had saved. Every heartbeat, every breath, every smile of relief was proof enough of her extraordinary bravery. By midday, Barbara allowed herself a fleeting moment to rest, leaning against a broken wall. Her hands ached, her body screamed for relief, but her spirit remained unbroken. Around her, the soldiers she had tended were alive, breathing, and momentarily safe. She had faced fear, chaos, and exhaustion alone, and she had prevailed. Her courage, quiet yet unyielding, illuminated a world that seemed consumed by darkness. Barbara Young's legacy would live on in the hearts of those she saved. She had refused to abandon the wounded. She had acted with compassion in the face of unimaginable horror. And she had become a symbol of hope and resilience. The battlefield might have been scarred, the world broken, but in her presence, life endured. She was a solitary light, unwavering, a testament to the extraordinary power of one woman determined to save lives, no matter the cost. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across the scarred battlefield. Barbara Young moved tirelessly among the injured, her eyes constantly scanning for the slightest sign of life. Every groan, every cough, every faint twitch of a hand pulled her forward. She could not afford to rest, not now, not when lives hung by the thinnest threads. A young soldier, pale and trembling, struggled to remain conscious. Barbara knelt beside him, fingers working quickly to staunch the bleeding. "You're going to make it," she whispered, her voice calm but commanding. He nodded faintly, eyes wide with disbelief that anyone could stay in this hell and care so completely. She held his hand until the tremors subsided, her presence alone a lifeline against despair. Around her, the battlefield was littered with the remnants of war, twisted metal, broken wood, discarded weapons, and bloodied uniforms. Yet within this chaos, Barbara carved a fragile pocket of life. She shifted stretchers, applied bandages, offered water, and whispered quiet words of reassurance. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and fueled by determination. Fear had no dominion here. Her courage was an unspoken shield. A sudden cry alerted her to a soldier trapped beneath rubble. Barbara rushed forward, ignoring splintered debris and jagged metal. Her hands, raw and scratched, worked methodically to free him. Once freed, she cleaned his wounds, wrapped torn clothing around injuries, and whispered encouragement, grounding him with her unwavering presence. She acted not with hesitation, but with certainty, every second a battle against death itself. Night descended, and Barbara continued her tireless rounds. Her body ached, but she pressed on, driven by a singular purpose, to save as many lives as possible. Each soldier she helped became a beacon of hope in the darkness. They whispered her name, sometimes in awe, sometimes in disbelief, yet she never paused for recognition. The lives she preserved were the only testament she needed. The night was heavy, filled with the quiet groans of the wounded and the distant echo of artillery. Barbara moved like a shadow, fluid and unstoppable, attending to every soldier she could find. Her hands were skilled, steady, and unyielding, improvising with whatever materials she had on hand. Torn uniforms became bandages, splintered wood became makeshift splints. Every action was deliberate, every motion calculated to preserve life. She approached a young corporal whose uniform was soaked in blood. Fear and confusion marked his face, but Barbara knelt beside him and whispered assurances. Her touch was firm yet gentle, and her words carried authority, hope, and compassion all at once. He clutched her hands, drawing courage from her presence, understanding for the first time in hours that someone was there to fight for him. Time became meaningless. Hours stretched into minutes, minutes into seconds, and Barbara worked tirelessly, moving from soldier to soldier. She checked pulses, readjusted bandages, offered water, and whispered encouragement. Her presence was a lifeline, a fragile anchor of stability amidst chaos. Even the most terrified soldiers found solace in her calm and unwavering determination. Suddenly, a cry from the shadows drew her attention. A soldier was trapped beneath a fallen beam, writhing in pain. Without hesitation, Barbara raced forward, ignoring the jagged terrain. Her hands worked quickly, carefully, stabilizing him, wrapping wounds, and murmuring words of hope. Fear had no place here. Only courage, compassion, and action mattered. The battlefield was quiet now, a tense stillness that spoke of exhaustion and lingering danger. Barbara Young moved among the wounded, attending to their needs with precision and care. She was relentless, checking each soldier for hidden injuries, adjusting bandages, distributing water, and offering gentle reassurance. Every action was purposeful. Every second mattered. A young private's eyes filled with tears as he realized he had survived another night. Barbara knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back and whispering words of encouragement. "You're going to make it," she said. "You're not alone." In that moment, the boy understood the full weight of her bravery. She had stayed when everyone else had fled, choosing compassion over safety, life over fear. Around her, the battlefield was littered with reminders of the cost of war: broken weapons, bloodied uniforms, shattered buildings. Yet Barbara remained a steadfast presence, a symbol of resilience and hope. She shifted stretchers, freed trapped soldiers, and improvised solutions to injuries with limited resources. Every life she touched became a testament to the extraordinary power of one person determined to fight for others. Night fell again, and Barbara continued her rounds. Her body ached, her hands were raw, but she did not stop. Soldiers whispered her name in awe, recounting her actions quietly, forming a legend that would endure long after the battle ended. Recognition was unnecessary. The heartbeat of the wounded was all the acknowledgement she needed. By the end of the night, Barbara had preserved countless lives, her courage shining as a beacon in a world consumed by chaos. She had faced death, fear, and despair, and emerged as a solitary, unwavering force. Dawn broke over the battlefield, washing the landscape in muted golden light. Barbara Young moved slowly, deliberately, checking on the soldiers she had tended through the night. Each pulse, each shallow breath, each flicker of consciousness was a victory. Her exhaustion was immense, yet her determination remained unshakable. A soldier she had rescued the night before approached her, eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. You stayed," he whispered. Barbara smiled faintly, brushing bloodied hair from her face. "Of course," she said simply. "I couldn't leave anyone behind." Her courage, quiet and relentless, had created a circle of survival in a world that seemed determined to take everything. Around her, the battlefield was scarred and silent, a stark reminder of the cost of war. Yet in her small circle, dozens of lives had been preserved. Barbara had become more than a nurse, more than a woman. She had become a symbol, a legend among the soldiers she saved. Her actions demonstrated the extraordinary power of resilience, compassion, and unwavering determination. As she walked among the wounded one last time, Barbara reflected on the night that had changed everything. She had faced the horrors of war alone, yet refused to abandon those who depended on her. Each life she had touched was proof that courage could endure, that hope could survive even in the darkest moments. Barbara Young's legacy would live on, whispered among soldiers and remembered in the hearts of those she saved. She had stayed when everyone else fled, comforted the wounded when despair was all around, and shone as a solitary light in the darkness. The battlefield might have been scarred, the world broken, but her courage, compassion, and determination had created life, hope, and a story that would never be forgotten.